Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome to Madison's Notes, the official podcast of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions. I'm your host, Laura Laurent, and on this week we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Reid Blackman. He is the author of Ethical Machines, creator and host of the podcast also named Ethical Machines, and founder and CEO of Virtue, a digital ethical risk consultancy. He is an advisor to the Canadian government on their federal AI regulations, was the founding member of Ernst & Young's AI Advisory Board, and a senior advisor to the Deloitte AI Institute. His work, which includes advising and speaking to organizations including AWS, US Bank, the FBI, NASA, and the World Economic Forum, has been profiled by the Wall Street Journal, the BBC, and Forbes. His written work appears in the Harvard Business Review and the New York Times. Prior to founding Virtue, Dr. Blackman was a professor of philosophy at Colgate University and UNC-Chapel Hill, and, for fun, spent a stint of time running a fireworks company. So, join us as we get into the questions of what it takes to create, maintain, and hold ethical integrity in the world of modern technology, the complexities of the environment, and who is needed in helping solve our current dilemmas. Without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Blackman to the show. Dr. Blackman, thank you so much for coming on to Madison's Notes. I'm really looking forward to this conversation about your new book, Ethical Machines. First off, our listenership is very interested in political philosophy and American constitutional studies. However, I think there's a really important crossover between what's happening in our modern day technological economy and the ethics behind it. So I just so appreciate you coming in to have a conversation with us about it.
I'll try not to disappoint. No guarantees.
Great. Well, so first off, in your book, you start off with making a distinction between AI for good versus AI for not bad. And I think that's a really important place for us to start in our conversation as well, and understanding some of the ethical motivations that we'll later be pursuing in considering algorithms and AI ethics.
Yeah, so one reason I start there is that there's just a sort of lot of people in the AI ethics space where I think they get confused between pursuing positively, sort of obviously ethical goals using the tool that is AI versus you're going to use it in a bank, you're using it in financial services, you're using it for, I don't know, identifying gases or something like that in a mine, in a diamond mine or something, or using it for in the context of consumer packaged goods, and they're not trying to use AI in order to pursue the common good, create some great things in the world, cure cancer, whatever. They're just using it for business as usual. And so those people, if AI ethics is just taken to be about doing good in the world, making the world a better place, the vast majority of people who are actually developing and using AI are not going to care about that. That's not their thing. It's great if they also care about it, but for the vast majority of cases, we're seeing AI in businesses being used, designed and used by businesses. And what they care about is business. They care about their standard goals, sales, the things that they're trying to sell, whether it's services or goods or whatever it is. And, or if that, could be in a healthcare setting as well, but they're focused on their patients in just the way that they are right now. So those people want to use AI, and what we need to prioritize is that they just don't screw things up. That's really it. Use AI to do the great things that you're doing, or at least the ethically neutral stuff that you're pursuing, and do it in a way that's not ethically problematic. Let's just avoid disaster. That's another way of putting it.
And where do you see the disasters coming in most frequently? Like, what are the challenges that these developers are facing that are creating the outcomes which we desire to avoid?
There's very familiar ones. So I like to distinguish between the ethical risks. By the way, ethical risk is a phrase that I never would have used when I was an academic philosopher. It's sort of a phrase that I coined. I'm not saying I'm the only one who's coined it. There could be other people who also started using the phrase that are around the time that I did. But there's the ethical risks that are probable by virtue of how AI works. I mean, by AI, I just mean machine learning. And then there are a set of risks that are likely by virtue of the use case, by virtue of the context of deployment or what you're trying to do with it. And so when you're talking about what are the ethical risks that are not merely likely but probable given how AI works, then we're talking about, this is the sort of, 3 chapters of my book, One is bias or discriminatory outputs, one is privacy violations, and one is the explainability problem. You're just going to run into those because of how AI works. Then there are other things that are not about the nature of the beast, as those are, but rather about the purposes to which you put the beast. So if you say, okay, beast, let's make a self-driving car. Well, now you introduce the new ethical risk of killing and maiming pedestrians. Because of how ML or AI works, it's because of what you're trying to do.
And you come to mention the nature of the beast. And this is something often we hear an argument around, oh, well, tools are ethically neutral. You know, you have a hammer or a screwdriver, and it has a specific intended purpose, but you could use it for an alternative purpose, which ends up being harmful to apply it to other places. So would you say that AI is just ethically neutral and it's not something that we have to worry about on the moral spectrum? Or is it more complex than that, and does it invite other moral implications in its nature?
Yeah, so I think that, as I'm sure that you anticipated my answer, that there's a certain kind of way that AI gets developed such that there are ethical decisions, or at least decisions with ethical impacts or ethical implications, embedded in that design, build, testing process. So with a screwdriver, yes, to your point, you could use it to build concentration camps. You can use it to build homes for the poor. There's nothing about the way the screwdriver was designed to make it a case that building one of those kinds of things is more probable than the other. It's completely, I shouldn't say completely neutral, but if there are such things as neutral tools, then that's a really good candidate. On the other hand, when you are designing AI models, and more broadly, when you're designing solutions in which AI is embedded, you're making a variety of decisions that either have ethical content or they have ethical implications. So most obviously, the one that everyone loves to talk about is you choose what training data you're going to use, and that training data might be such that it's going to lead to discriminatory or biased outputs. So for example that everybody loves to use is facial recognition software. If you've got a bunch of training data, and so you train your AI with that training data just it's just photos of people, and so that you can see photos of faces, and you don't have a lot of, say, faces of black women in various lighting conditions and angles, then your facial recognition software is going to be really bad at recognizing black women in photos of various kinds. And so you have, in some sense, a biased or discriminatory facial recognition AI system. So you might not have decided that you wanted to make this not work for black women. You don't have any ill intent. You may have even intentionally gone out trying to make it the case that it works equally well for all people. And for whatever reason, you didn't notice or you couldn't get to the data, but the data is such that, oh, it doesn't work for black women, as one example. Then there are more high stakes things like, let's say, diagnosing diabetes. Then if you don't have data from various kinds of ethnicities, then you might get a diabetes detection system that works really well for white men, but not for black women, not because you intended any such discrimination, but because you chose the training data and then you didn't think about, hey, I wonder how this training data might affect the outputs here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's one way, that's just one example in which the ethical decision or the decision with ethical implications is built into the system. And that means that the end user might use an AI in a way that has ethically bad consequences that they don't intend, sort of directly, right? So they're using this diabetes detection system without any intention to discriminate against their black patients, but here they are not doing as well for their black patients as they are for their white patients. With the screwdriver, it all sort of, I'm inclined to say something like the moral value just sort of is directly inherited from the intentions of the user of the screwdriver, not from the builder of the screwdriver or the designer of the screwdriver. It's from the intentions. But in this case, AI can be used in a way that harms people directly without the intention to harm by the user of the AI.
Mm-hmm. I think it's such an interesting moral quandary for us to ponder when our intentions are removed or are more removed from our use of tools. And you describe in your book a somewhat simple structure to address ethical concerns for AI development. It's a very comprehensive approach. And I'm curious, why do you think it's important to break it up and add more people to this team to think about these problems versus just taking a problem once it shows up and triaging it? Like, why do we need such an extensive program around this?
I see. Okay. So there's two things to say. One thing to say, by the way, just before we move on, is that it does raise interesting questions about how we blame people or who's to blame. And I think that in some cases, when people were building AI and they didn't know the kinds of implications, they couldn't have known, or were sort of too early on in the research, and you wind up making, let's say it's 2015, and you make a hiring AI that reads resumes and is discriminatory against, say, Black people, and I'm inclined to think that that person is in all likelihood not blameworthy because they couldn't have known. We're at a point now where if you don't look at your training data as one example, you don't check for bias. Now blame is appropriate, not because you intended to discriminate or anything like that, but because you should have known better. You should have known that you need to check these things in case of unintentional but very real discriminatory impacts. So that's just
Yes.
one small note. Now, I think your question is the something like, why do you need? I call it an AI ethical risk program. Corporations tend to call it a responsible AI program. Some people are now calling it AI governance. Is that what you mean? Why build this whole program?
Yeah.
Well, because it's not enough to just say, hey, we think this is good and this is bad and yada yada yada. It's not. It can't just sort of live on corporate values. It's not about a code of corporate conduct, as an example, because as we've been pointing out already, this is not about bad behavior. It's not like a Me Too thing where there are some real pieces of garbage out there doing things they shouldn't be doing. And we know they shouldn't be doing it. And in some sense, they know, I think, that they shouldn't be doing it. This is like mostly data scientists, engineers, just stepping in mud without even realizing it. It's not bad behavior. It's in some cases ignorance. In some cases, it's lack of, probably in the vast majority of cases, it's lack of organizational support. And if you want frontline data scientists, junior, who are, in most cases, relatively junior employees, because they're, the ones who are, if they're not collecting data, you have, engineers maybe collecting data, but then you have choosing algorithms and choosing models and testing and blah, 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 blah. Those people need their bosses to say, hey, make sure that you check for these potential ethical implications, privacy violations, whether explainability is a real problem here, bias or discrimination. If you're talking about generative AI, then issues abound, hallucinations being one of the most popular issues to talk about. So what large organizations need, and here I'm especially talking about, say, Fortune 500 companies, there are these sprawling entities. They have teams spread across countries and continents. They need a tremendous amount of upskilling, some training, learning and development, education, whatever you want to call it, because a lot of the data scientists and engineers don't know about these kinds of risks. Even if they do know about the kinds of risks, they might not have the tools to identify and manage them. Even if they do have the tools, they might not have the organizational support that gives them literally the time to do it. Right? You've got in academia, you can sit around, you can talk about ethical issues, till the cows come home. But in the business world, you're on a team, you got deadlines. You got a project manager who's like, this thing's due now. And yes, of course, in an ideal world, you'd have all these brave souls speaking up and saying, actually, no, we're not going to meet our deadline because we need to do these ethical checks. That's not going to happen. If what you need is frontline data scientists to be courageous, potentially put their job on the line, then forget it. It's not going to happen. And so part of the point of the program is, well, among other things, is to make it the case that it does not require an act of courage in order to say, hey, let's look at the ethical risks here. Rather, it's just what we do. This is just part of our workflow. Just part of I come in at 7 a.m. and 7 to 7:30, I check for ethical risks. 7:30 to 8 o'clock, I check for accuracy. Whatever. It's not quite that literal, but it's just part of what they do, and they're doing that because it's commensurate with the policy, the enterprise-wide, the company-wide policy, and the policy has embedded in it certain kinds of standards or values that they have to live up to. So you need this program to get the right kind of enablement for people to do this work at all.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's a really good distinction to make, in that when I first entered consulting, I definitely wanted to be that moral voice of certain things. Something would come up and they always say the squeaky wheel gets the oil, and I'd be like, hey, there's a problem here, but there's only so much you can do before you start jeopardizing your contacts, you start jeopardizing the timeline. And to be frank, most of the business just doesn't want to be that ethical on the ground. And so I think it's really important for how you describe to systematize it in that, like, personal virtue, yes, great. And also we kind of got to bake this in, otherwise it's not going to get done.
Yeah. One thing I want to highlight in response to that, you said the company doesn't want to be ethical. I think that academics, and I speak as having been one for the vast majority of my career, was a professor for 10 years and of course grad student before that. So I didn't leave academia until I was, I don't know, almost 40, something like that. You've got this idea. I think academics have this in their head, and I have this in my head. Like, there's a CEO who's twirling his mustache and thinking about money. Yeah, they're just like evil people, and the CEO oversees all, knows all, directs all, and it all comes down to that CEO. And what I've learned after consulting now for, I don't know, over 6 years now, is that nobody knows anything in corporations. The left hand does not know what the 8,000 right hands are doing. The CEO is
No.
no exception here. The CEO has a view from 30,000 feet. They can't, I mean, if they're overseeing 50,000, 100,000 people, thousands of departments, again, spread across countries and continents, there's only so much they can know. So
Hmm.
I don't think it's, I don't, I try to avoid saying things like the company doesn't care.
Hmm.
I, I think there's an extent to which it's true to say that certain senior executives don't care enough. That's true. I've yet to come across really evil people who are like, the hell with ethics and AI. It's, I've never used this metaphor before, and I don't know if I'm going to endorse it 5 minutes from now, but I want to say that it's something like a lack of muscle memory. Like you raise the ethics concern, and they literally, they don't know what to do. So you could be a champion, you could be courageous and say, no, hold on a second. We've got some ethical issues here. And those people are going to, for the most part, if they haven't had the training or the education and they don't have the tools and they don't have the green light and they don't have someone overseeing them do that kind of thing and they don't have the financial incentive and they don't have the culture that supports them caring about such things, they literally are kind of stuck. So I think that there's lots of individuals within an organization that care and want to do the right thing in the right way, blah, 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 but they literally do not know how. And if you don't know how, then the thing to do is like, yeah, I'm not sure how to do that, and we don't have the time for it, so let's just press forward. But if they were trained to know what to do, to spring into action, if there were dedicated escalation procedures for, hey, I see a red flag here, I'm going to escalate it to the appropriate party, and that party has the right kind of training to deal with it appropriately. Okay, now you have an organization that can handle it. But just the sort of lone, courageous person, forget it. Not going to get anything done.
Yeah. Well, and it seems like it really comes down to a knowledge management of the awareness of what the company can provide, what the resources are, and then also individually having the resources to react when somebody says something.
I mean, there's a lot to it. I mean, we sort of focused so far on sort of the individual data scientist or engineer, or even the team. But then there's, as I just mentioned, escalation procedure. So who do you escalate issues to? Is that an ethics committee of some kind? Who's on the ethics committee? What authority does that committee have? What are the grounds on which they make decisions?
Hmm.
What kind of authority do they have? Can they red light things and green light things? Um, what's their authority relative to other existing risk committees, like a financial risk committee or
Hmm.
a brand risk committee or a cyber risk committee or a whatever? So there's lots to do there, and then there's things like, if you're a giant organization, you just say, okay, everyone, we've got this policy for being ethical. That doesn't mean anything to anyone. Again, academics think, oh, if there's a policy, then everyone will abide by the policy. But there's hundreds, thousands of pages of policy. No one knows what they are. And even if they did, it doesn't mean that they know how to translate it into their day to day. So you might have this high level policy that says, you know, check for ethical risks in your AI or something along those lines. And here are the risk categories: privacy, respect for persons, justice, accountability, whatever it is. But they're like, okay, but when do I do what? Like, they need very clear instructions. They need clear not checkbooks, checklists. They need training for their particular role. How does that enterprise-wide policy apply to me in this role in my day to day? And if that translation work is not done, it's not getting done.
Hmm.
And people are not, again, this is for those academics out there, people are not eager to read the policy and read it like an academic would, understand it, digest it, and then translate it into how they do their work.
Hmm.
That's not happening. So that work needs to be done by the organization.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, and I think for academics or lay people, there can be this disposition towards technology and AI specifically of, like you said, the evil corporate master with the mustache twirling it, ready to do something evil with it. And for me, it gives me a different perspective of, okay, it's not ill intent, but how do we implement strategies such that we have integral practices that avoid these things? And it's a long process. It's very complicated. So having that perspective honestly feels like I have a little bit more grace for what's going on and everything. I'm
Yeah.
like, this is
Right. Yeah.
hard. It's hard, and it's hard as an individual working for a company to know those company policies. It's hard for somebody trying to implement them, trying to if you hire a consulting firm to come in and and show you these different things. Yeah, it's just very complicated.
It is very complicated. I'll say another thing. So yes, it's complicated, and it has to be rolled out, right? It's not like you release the policy, then your 100,000 employees read it and they comply with it, and you're good. No way. So how do you roll out this program in a way that makes sense, in a way that can actually be efficiently and effectively adopted? I don't like to say that it's difficult,
Mm.
because that makes it sound like we don't know what to do sometimes. So a lot of, I think, executives will kind of stall by saying this is really hard stuff.
Yeah.
It's really hard to know what to do and figure out what to do. And I don't think that's the case. I think that if you have the right kinds of experts in the room, then I don't want to say it's easy, but it's somewhat straightforward. That we know what to do. The biggest problem, in my view, is a lack of political will to actually do it.
Mm.
And that's where we get to, again, not quite the evil. I don't think we get to evil, but I think we get to competing priorities.
Mm-hmm.
They're competing priorities. I mean, you're a senior executive. Like, you gotta do the things that keep the lights on. You do have to, hit your numbers or make sure there's operational efficiency, hold people to account. Like we said, these are big, massive machines, and there's lots of people involved to make sure that these things are working. And so, again, it's not evil, but it is a sufficient priority? And not until it's a sufficient priority for a sufficient number of people among the senior executives are you going to get the political will to actually pull it off.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and something that I appreciated about your book is that it is very easy to read. It's very clear every time you're talking about these different structures. It's for ethical AI, blah, blah. And then you get to the end, and I like that you pull a little bit of a fast one on the readers, and you're like, because the whole time you're comparing oftentimes the technology and the quantitative certainty of certain types of information that we would like to be able to rely on when developing an ethical program versus
Sure.
ethics often getting the rap that it's squishy or it's subjective and therefore we can't really work with it in a technology space. And you go through this whole process of explaining a framework for ethical AI, and then you say, I haven't just shown you a framework for ethical AI, I've just shown you how to do ethics for any kind of program. So
Yeah.
I could see that in your writing as well, that it's not necessarily just difficult. It can be clear, and it's the challenges come out in different avenues as opposed to it being the ethics is the problem and that's why we should stall on it.
Right. Right. I mean, for the ethics, there are one thing that academics especially like to focus on are these sort of ethical gray areas, the tough cases. Like,
Hmm.
how do we deal with these ethical tough cases? And we got to think about these, and corporations have to think about these tough gray cases. But that's not like 5% of the work. And it's not even the first thing that you do. The first thing is, let's just set up some guardrail. Let's just set up some procedures to, what are we trying to do here? What's off limits? What do we check for?
Hmm.
Um, yeah, you need a system in place so that you can flag the high risk stuff and escalate that to the appropriate people. But the hard cases, and there are hard ethical cases, just like there are in any sort of field, like in healthcare and medicine, there are hard ethical cases. It's not clear what to do. Organ transplantation, abortion, euthanasia, etc. So there's tough cases that people are going to argue about. But I mean, this is actually a good comparison. In healthcare, you've got lots of sort of mechanisms for things being ethically sound, and it's on the exceptional cases that say something will go to an ethics committee in a hospital. It's not every single thing.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I'm curious a little bit more about your background as an academic moving into consulting. I mean, and you've written this book for not academics particularly, but
Yeah.
what was your transition space between going from pure philosophy into this very practical, very on the ground, very hands-on implementation of value and ethics?
So there's a number of things to say. So it wasn't me. I mean, one thing that I benefited from is that I've sort of had small businesses before, small things, nothing big, and not consulting wise. I have a fireworks company. I don't run it anymore, but it's still there. Yeah, so I sort of understood. I think from start growing that business, starting from nothing and growing it and operating it, I started to understand, what business looks like, what people are actually doing. I also was a mentor to startups when I was a professor as part of the entrepreneurship organization. And so there were lots of other mentors who were way more experienced than I was, and hearing their advice. And then it's a lot of observation and, I talked to everyone and their mother. Like, anyone who wanted to talk to me about AI ethics at a business, I was talking to them. It didn't matter. anything. And I just kept, you just learn. You learn that way. That's one reason, one of my earliest conversations, and this was when I was still a professor and I was taught, but I knew I was on the way out, and I knew I was starting this business, and I started talking to people and started to use a word that I used to hate, but now I get, networking. People would say like, "Oh, this was someone at Starbucks." I'm like, decently senior executive at Starbucks, who said, you shouldn't use the word ethics. People don't like that. They don't like that word. My response was, okay, I'm just gonna own the word ethics then. If everyone's scared to say it, and I'm not, I'm an ethicist. I'll say ethics, and that'll be sort of like a way of marketing myself. And then another person said, we used to do, this was when I was learning about the responsible investment space, or ESG investing, or sustainable investing. So this is, trying to put money into, I would just say, ethically sound organizations, having that be part of your investment strategy. We tried this and that, and people didn't really get it. They didn't like it. And what I learned eventually was you have to put some kind of risk in there. And so that's why I started talking about ethical risk. So that was part of the transition, talking less about AI ethics and talking more about, actually at the time, I wasn't even talking about AI in particular. I was talking about ethics more generally. Using the phrase ethical risk instead, because that's something that businesses understand. Getting away from the mindset of an academic who's always trying to think about what's the ideal here, what's the right thing to do, what's the good thing, what's the bet, what would a good organization do?
Yeah.
And transitioning from that to thinking about, okay, look, we're a business, we've got these competing priorities, we don't want to do anything ethically nightmarish, but we're not angels here. We still need to do business. We still have things that compete with our timelines. So how do we identify and manage and mitigate those risks? That was a different way of thinking from academia. I don't know, am I answering your question? Is that?
Absolutely. No, and I think it's interesting. And I wanted to ask, I'm curious, a lot of academics or academically minded people who might not even be in academics anymore, but enjoy that kind of thought work, it can sometimes be difficult to understand why people are so afraid of ethics. And can you help us understand a little bit more about how individuals who might not, who like the Starbucks person said, like, you shouldn't use that word. Like, why is that? And how do you address their concerns when you're presenting to them to convince them to come on board?
So, okay, a couple things. First thing is that I don't try to convince anyone to come on board. I never try to give a sort of hard sell or a hard pitch, because I'll never win. There's no way. There's no way I'm going to get to someone from, they don't know anything about AI ethics, to now they know something about it, they get it, they see it's important, and now they want to do something about it and spend real resources on it, both money, political capital, bandwidth. So I don't sell anyone in that sense. Anytime I'm talking to a potential client, they're already sold on the value of doing this sort of thing. And then what they need to get sold on is that me and my team are the right people to help them. So,
Okay.
but it's not like a buy now, or here's the 3 reasons why you should do this. I don't ever do that stuff, because I'll never win.
Yeah.
So that's one thing to say. What was the other part of the question?
Why are people so opposed to ethics?
Oh, right.
Yeah.
I don't know. I swear, I would love to tell you the answer. I don't know. It's a bizarre phenomenon, because they don't have any trouble talking about ethics in their personal lives in a sort of, so-and-so betrayed me, he or she cheated on me, you lied to me, you're dishonest, you killed that person. We have no problem talking about the unethical actions of individuals. For some bananas reason that I don't fully understand. I mean, there's probably not the reason. There's probably a bunch of explanations for why people are like this. But when it comes to a business context, if you're not talking about sort of just obviously ethically egregious action, like, sexual harassment, discrimination on the basis of race or gender or something, dumping pollutants into water that kids are drinking from. If you're not talking about something crazily ethically egregious, they're just sort of like, what do you mean the law? You mean well, it's not illegal. It's why is there this sort of brain disconnect between talking about ethics in a sort of everyday setting and talking about ethics in a business setting? I don't know. I honestly, It's bizarre. I mean, I can sort of rattle off a couple of empirical explanations, right? Some people think that there are empirical explanations that are speculative, and surely not part of the whole story. But there's Milton Friedman, and there's a way of thinking about business that, ethics and business have nothing to do with each other. Business is about profit, it's about the bottom line. And so ethics has no place here. The only obligation is to maximize shareholder value, blah, 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 blah. That's probably in the mix somewhere. I
Mm-hmm.
don't, I don't, I don't think, I actually don't think it's a very big part of the explanation, because I don't think that, I don't know, most these corporations are, let's say they're 100,000 people. I don't think most of them have read Milton Friedman. I don't think I don't think they think very much about the function or the definition or the obligations of a business qua business. That's just not a
Mm-hmm.
thing that weighs on them.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't think that maybe that's somewhere in the explanation. I mean, obviously there are some people who've read too much Ayn Rand and now they have too much power. I mean, so that's one kind of thing. But by and large, I don't know. It's just
Yeah.
they freeze. They freeze when you start saying, "Oh, what are the ethical issues?" Especially if you get some people in there, like lawyers are really bad at asking ethical questions. Some of them are good. I bet some really good ones, but a lot of them they can't disentangle the ethical question from the legal question, and it just collapses to a legal question. And you're like, no, no, no. I know it's not illegal, but I'm asking if it's unethical. And they're like, well, it's fine by virtue of the statutes and the regulations. Like, Jesus, you can't even hear the question anymore, can you?
Well, and perhaps part of it is the fear of the subjectivism or the perception that ethics is such a subjective conversation, at least in these business settings, which is strange because, like you said, in personal lives, people are apt to take up arms. But and you address this in your book a bit of saying in that you distinguish between what people believe is right and what is actually right, and it
Sure.
kind of gives an olive branch to those people to say, hey, you can continue the conversation of ethics even if we disagree about it, which I think is an important to note to make when actually having these conversations on the ground.
I also think, people, I think they think it's judgmental to say something is unethical in some way, or they're afraid that if they say some business practice is unethical, that's a way of being judgmental. So you can say something like, well, that's going to be a real cyber risk, and that's not going to personally offend anyone. If you say that's going to be a real ethical risk, now it sounds like you're accusing them of being unethical and they don't like that.
Yeah.
That's got to be in the mix. But yeah, I think that the view that that ethics is subjective, I can't tell how much that plays a role. I sort of think that might be less an explanation of why they don't make the judgment and
Hmm.
more a post hoc rationalization for why they don't make the judgment. Well, why don't you think that's unethical? Oh well, yeah, ethics is subjective. I think it's sort of a defensive maneuver as opposed to an explanation for why they actually won't make the ethical judgment.
It's more of an avoidance tactic than anything.
It's
Um,
a thin justification, in my view, a thin justification for alleged justification for why they are not taking the ethical stance that they ought to, or taking one at all, for that matter.
hmm hmm Yeah. I'm curious when it comes to trusting technology. I mean, it's easy to understand trust when we're in a relationship with someone. There's something quite tangible, experiences or feelings that we have about our relationships. But when it comes to technology, and this is getting a little bit more into just your personal opinion versus the book, but how is trusting technology different from trusting a human? And how do we? Is it should we trust technology? What is the appropriate disposition towards the algorithms that we'll be subject to throughout our experiences?
A couple things to say about this. Some people don't like talking about trust in technology because they think, you trust a person, you can't trust technology. I don't think
Hmm.
that's quite right. Because you can say something like, I'm not sure that I trust this bridge. You're trying to cross a bridge that's kind of
Yeah.
rickety, or walking across the limb on the limb of the limb of this tree. And you're like, I don't know if
Hmm.
I trust this limb. So I think we normally talk about trust in terms of in relation to some, non-person object.
Hmm.
So I don't think that's unusual. I don't trust this car to be able to drive across country without breaking down. I think that's a totally normal way of speaking. Um, yeah. So I don't love the reason trust for different reasons, because I think it's kind of a catch-all.
Hmm.
It has to do with engineering efficiency or excellence. It has to do with cybersecurity. It has to do with ethics. It's just too much stuff. It's just this catch-all term that means all the stuff that needs to work well is working well. It's not like you can sort of, if you like, directly pursue trust or trustworthiness more accurately. It's
Yeah.
all the other things that need to get right. So that you need to get right. So some people talk about, like, we need to build trustworthy AI. And I'm like, what does that?
Mean.
That just means you need to build AI that doesn't go wrong in the 100 ways that it could go wrong. Okay, fine. The other thing is that so convinced that we typically operate with a positive attitude of trust as opposed to the absence of distrust.
Mm,
So I think, I don't know, I use my iPhone. I don't know that I trust it to deliver my email. That seems weird. I trust it
yeah.
to deliver my email when someone sends me an email. I would say that I don't manifest distrust. There's a lack of distrust that I have. So there's the absence of an attitude, not the presence of one. Um, and so I think in most cases, what we want is AI that we don't manifest distrust for. And that's fine.
Hmm.
We don't need to sort of have this positive attitude of like, I trust my AI like I trust my wife. Whatever that would be bananas.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, does that someone answer the question about trust?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think it starts to make the distinction between um it continues the reflection of making distinctions between trusting a person or trusting a physical experience that you're having on a tree limb versus our dispositions towards the technology that we're using and what they're intended for
Yeah,
and what kind of relationship we have with them.
and then there's also we're saying I don't trust this thing might be shorthand for I don't trust the people who made this thing. You
Yeah.
might say like, yeah, I mean, let's say I don't trust Apple. I don't have
Yeah.
that attitude. I don't. I trust my iPhone to keep my data secure or some such. That might be shorthand for I trust that Apple has built it in such a way that blah blah blah, and I just
Mhm.
say that by saying I trust the phone. I don't trust Tesla. Why might not? Well, I don't trust Tesla cars. Why not? Well, because what I really don't trust is not the technology. I don't trust Elon Musk or something along those
Yeah.
lines. So sometimes we're really just talking about the people who built it.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, which is important to note when we're making choices about how we engage with technology. And it's interesting you note this in your book about transparency and an ability to view into the algorithms or to have some sort of communicability about what how they were developed. And when it comes to visibility, essentially, I want to ask about like the difference between some kind of black box algorithm, buzzword, versus something that is communicable but is somehow proprietary. Like, is it the ethically correct thing to provide users with an understanding of how the algorithms are going to make decisions about them?
Okay, so one thing I wanted to draw your attention to is the difference between explainability and transparency.
Okay.
So explainability has to do with what goes on between the inputs and the outputs of the model. So you have some input, let's say it's a resume or it's a application for credit or something along those lines, and it outputs yes, you get a job interview or no, you don't, or yes, you get a credit, you get a credit card or no, you don't, or whatever it is. Get a mortgage, no, you don't. What happens in between the inputs and the outputs, we might not know what the heck is going on in there because the math is too complicated. We sort of speak the language, but the sentence is too damn long for us to keep in our head.
Hmm.
Like a 50-page sentence. It's like, wait, what happened to be? I forgot already. So that's the explainability issue versus the transparency issue is just are you telling people the things that you ought to be telling them?
Mm.
And so
Mm.
you can have high explainability and low transparency, right? So high explainability would be we know exactly how this model works, how this AI works, but don't tell anyone. That's low transparency. As opposed to high transparency and low explainability, it's like, hey, everyone, we've got this black box model. We've got this model that we don't understand how it works. So
Hmm.
high transparency, low explainability. So I would pull those two things apart. And then the question is, what do we owe to people about how it works? So something like, what are our obligations related to transparency with regards to how the model works, which is an
Hmm.
explainability issue. Okay.
Yeah.
It varies. That's the short answer. That's the short, unsatisfying answer. I think sometimes people, they deserve and sometimes an explanation. Sometimes they don't. So, for instance, if I say, "Hey, Apple," let's say, how does this thing know? How does the AI work that when I take a picture of my daughter, it goes into the folder of pictures of my daughter? How does that facial recognition and matching software? How does that work? I don't think I'm owed an explanation of any sort for how it works. Not ethically speaking. Maybe it'd be nice of them or something like that, but they don't owe it to me. And who cares? On the other hand, if I'm a criminal defendant and someone's AI pushes out a high risk rating, and so now I don't get bail, or I'm not eligible for bail, or I don't get parole, okay, that's a lot different. Now I think I'm owed an explanation for how does this thing work. So it just depends upon the context, depends on the use case.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And I think it also bleeds into the conversation that you were having and the distinctions you were making between harm versus wronging. Can
Yeah.
you say a little bit more about that just for us to consider in thinking about how technology is going to affect us or when to be concerned about something or when to draw attention to something?
Yeah. So lots of people talk about ethical harms. Who's going to be harmed by this? Who, in the AI ethics space, that's the sort of that's the go-to word. Some have been harmed. I think it has a number of problems with it. Because what we should be focusing on first is who's wronged. Who
Mm,
have you ethically wronged? Who's justifiably aggrieved in such a way that they're owed something in response?
mm,
And it's a case that you ought not to have done it because you shouldn't do ethically wrong things, all else equal. Harm doesn't have that. So harm, it's a feeling usually. It's usually physical harm or emotional harm. I'm not sure that there are other kinds of harms other than physical and emotional harm. I mean, if you violate someone's rights, maybe you've harmed them. Like if someone this whole time has been spying on me, right? Let's say that someone has been violating my privacy by virtue of surveilling me. They violated my privacy rights. I don't know. I don't think I've been harmed. I still have justification for saying you've wronged me, and you go to jail now or some such. But or here's a restraining order. But I haven't been physically harmed. I mean, fine, they didn't touch me. I'm not emotionally harmed. I didn't even know what was going on. This can go my whole life, and I never find out. I think it's fair to say that I was wronged. I was being wronged this whole time without being physically or emotionally harmed. Um, and then there are some people who deserve to be harmed. Right? If they're an aggressor, they should be harmed. Some people are emotionally harmed because you've made them extremely upset, but it's because, let's say, they're chauvinist pigs, and you gave women more rights than they want them to have. So yeah, you harmed those people. I mean, they are tearing their hair out. They are so upset. They're punching walls and they're pissed off and they're crying because this is not the way that I
mm.
don't know God wanted the world, and men should rule over women. Yeah, you've emotionally harmed them. They're seriously distraught. Oh well, like you didn't wrong them though, and you didn't wrong them because it's ethically required to give women equal rights. Blah 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 blah.
Yeah.
So harm just strikes me for a variety of reasons as the wrong concept. One last thing is that when you talk about harms, it's also natural to talk about the contrast of that, which is benefits. You talk about benefits and harms.
Mm,
And then very quickly, not in principle, but pragmatically, it quickly makes it the case that ethical inquiry becomes just moral calculus. Let's weigh up the benefits, let's weigh up the harms and see if the benefits outweigh the harms, then we're good to go. And that's just not true. That's a sort of straightforward, sort of flat-footed, simple utilitarian way of thinking about things or a consequentialist way of thinking about things. It's the way that Silicon Valley likes to talk about these things. It's the way that engineers like to talk about these things because it's math. Who
yeah.
doesn't love math? But that's not how ethics works. And so I also think that talking about harms as that being sort of your central ethical concept invites a flat-footed utilitarianism that allows you to wrong many people on the condition that the benefits overall outweigh those harms. And that's just the wrong way to do moral evaluation.
Hmm. And as far as your work, working with different companies, consulting, are you seeing, I mean, and you also say you accept work from people who already are interested in doing this. But are you seeing companies make the appropriate adjustments? Is it difficult to be working with some, like how much pushback are you getting once you're trying to implement something in a company?
I don't think that the pushback that I do get some pushback as I ought to,
Yeah.
but it's really not of an ethical variety usually. So one thing we'll do is we'll say, okay, so listen, let's figure out what these values are of yours and let's connect them to procedures. So if you respect people's privacy, so you say, what are you going to do about it? Does that mean you're never going to sell user data to third parties? Does it mean that you're going to check for potential for privacy violations at every stage of the AI lifecycle? Does it mean blah, 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 whatever? Is there certain kinds of data you're not going to try to collect? Um, just tell me what, and there are some things that are feasible and some things that are not. Here's a good one that philosophers, I think, or academics might not understand. You might say, like, well, ideally, because we respect people's privacy, we're going to give all the users control over their data, over the data that's about them,
Hmm.
so that they can decide for every piece of data that we have about them whether we can have it or not, whether they want to take it back or delete it, and they can determine what we can use it for. And maybe, yeah, if you're an academic, you're like, yeah, that's what you do. That is a huge technological lift. It's huge. I mean, data is freaking everywhere in an organization. It's flying this way and that. It's always in all these silos and these different programs, these different pieces of software that don't talk to each other. So the idea that a company is going to come forward and be like, okay, we're going to devote a tremendous amount of resources to make it the case that we know where Laura's data is throughout this Fortune 500 company. And then we're going to give her a user interface where she can have like a toggle switch and see all the data and do all that stuff. Like, first of all, you don't want to do that. Secondly, you can't. They're not going to do that. It's operationally and financially way too big of a lift. And so the pushback, that's an extreme version, and I'm using the word pushback loosely at this point, but the pushback comes not from no, that's ethically fine. If the pushback is, yeah, that would be good. I'm not sure if we can pull that off. That's going to require us to hire more people. If we're going to hire, that would require us hiring 2 more people to pull off that thing. Hiring 2 more people, they don't go into the numbers, but basically what they're saying is, if we hire 2 people, they make $150,000 each per year. That's $300 a year. Now we have benefits, so now we're at just call it $400,000 a year. Or now we got to get permission to spend an extra $400,000 a year in this department, which may or may not generate lots of revenue. So it's not like, oh, well, yeah, I think academics think, oh, whatever, $400,000 for a Fortune 500 company, it's a rounding error. That's not how budgets work. Like, Fortune 500 companies don't work like, okay, we've got $1 billion here, and then it's like, oh, is this a rounding error for us? Yes, let's do it. Because if you just did all these rounding errors at scale, then it wouldn't be a rounding error anymore. So this is just me saying, I don't think that the pushback that I ever get is something like, well, you might think that's unethical, but we think it's perfectly fine. It's usually not that. It's more like, that's going to be too hard to do.
Yeah.
Or maybe that's not going to be in phase 1 of rollout of the program. That'll be in like phase 5. Right now we're going to take care of the really high risk stuff, and that's it. 2 years from now, we'll start looking at the medium risk stuff and trying to mitigate those risks as well, as an example.
Yeah.
Because again, it's operationally expensive.
Absolutely. No, and I think it's really important to have, even if someone isn't in some sort of Fortune 500 business setting, to have an understanding of how complicated the infrastructure is.
For sure.
Yeah, the infrastructure is, and so getting people to work together to accomplish certain tasks, it's not as simple as saying, oh, we want this thing, we'll just go grab it real quick.
Exactly. And this is what I think academics typically think. It's like, oh, there's an organization, and the organization decides to do X, and then they do X. That is not how it works. It's a freaking mess. I am blown away by the fact that any of these companies actually operate. It seems impossible.
Yeah.
It's duct tape and bubble gum. That's it. There's no org charts. No one knows what anyone. There's 50 teams doing the same thing, and they don't even know about each other.
Yeah.
I mean, I found myself making introductions across organizations because this is especially when I was talking to everyone and their mother, anyone who would talk to me, year 1, year 2 of my business. I would talk to 2 different people within a giant organization who were both doing something related to AI ethics, so they didn't know each other.
Yeah.
Like, oh, you should meet so-and-so. I was playing like a matchmaker role. And so one thing that academics really don't get is just how complex these systems are, and it's really important because it's so freaking easy to say, oh yeah, the company should do X. They shouldn't do Y anymore. They should figure out it's so easy to say that. It is very hard to get all those people to even know that there's an issue, to understand why it's an issue that is worth being addressed against the set of other issues that they need to deal with, how they should pay attention to it or what they should do about it, and then to go out and do it, and then make sure that someone's actually done it. That we haven't even talked about monitoring all of the stuff going on. So it's one thing to have an AI ethics program. Part of that program is monitoring the program itself. Hey, how are we doing here? Is the AI ethics program doing what we wanted it to do? Is it being adopted efficiently? Is it effective? Is it having the impacts that we want? Is it not? If not, why not? Can we improve it? How do we improve it? Okay. And is all that work? I mean, that's a lot of stuff.
Well, okay, we only have a second more, but I have one last question for you. I'm curious, as you are looking across these different industries, across these different companies, you've got your own diverse background that you're bringing to this. What do you feel like the AI ethics industry needs more of right now? Does it need more developers who have an understanding of ethics? Does it need more philosophers who can help with the implementation? Like, who is needed on this effort right now in this industry?
I would love to tell you that it's more philosophers. It's not. It's just not. Yeah, I mean, because the vast majority of work that needs to be done is not thinking through tough ethical cases. If that were the case, if the big issue were there's a backload of these really hard ethical problems, and we need philosophers to either figure it out or to facilitate conversations among those people who need to figure it out, like leading a workshop. Okay, if that were the issue, then I'd say we need more philosophers, but that's not what's going on. What you need more of, I mean, honestly, what you need more of is, it's at the moment, what you need more of is senior executives who understand what the risks are and take them seriously. That's in high need. That means that they need education. They don't have that education. Again, philosophers not the best people to provide it. Maybe maybe they're like one of the 5-person team that's delivering a workshop, but they're not the main thing. And then, yes, you do need education, especially for younger data scientists, engineers, because this is, and I was talking about this with John Basil. He's a philosophy professor at Northeastern who works with industry and knows what he's talking about. We need education for the next wave, the next generation of data scientists and engineers, because eventually this is a generational effort. It's not like 5 years from now, it's not going to be the case that every organization has a robust AI ethics program. We're talking, it's going to be a while. Regulations might play a role in that, but we don't really have a good grip on when regulations are going to pass and how robust they're going to be, and they're probably not going to be sufficient for the task. So we need, in the short term, we need more education. Technologists do need to learn from people like philosophers. Philosophers need to learn a lot from technologists, but also other kinds of people need to be educated and brought to the table. So people in risk, people in innovation, people in compliance. These are kinds of roles that most academics are not familiar with, but they play a crucial function, and they need to be part of the conversation if you're going to have anything work in a large organization. Yeah. So education of lots of different people.
Yeah. Sounds like an encouragement to be more of a Renaissance person. So, well, Dr. Blackman, thank you so much for coming on the show today and giving us all these different perspectives to think about and take back home and consider. But just want to thank you for your time and the work that you're doing. It definitely adds to my intellectual world to consider. So appreciate it.
Yeah, nice to hear. No, it's my pleasure.
Thank you for tuning in on today's episode of Madison's Notes. I hope it gave you a different perspective of philosophy and ethics in the modern world and more insight into the current questions and dilemmas that we are facing. If you liked what you heard, of course, feel free to like and subscribe. And if you have thoughts and comments, please leave one on any major podcast platform. I'm Laura Laurent, and this has been Madison's Notes.